Welcome to the workshop session today. We're here with Craig Thomason, so the Director of Global Employee and Leadership Communication at Merck. Really grateful for having him here with us today. And today is all about the truth in action, how to tell the stories behind the data. So you can feel free to use the chat throughout the session. And if you want to ask a question, you can head to the Q&A tab, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And so while you're there, you can upvote questions, you can reply to them, you can submit your own. So does it sound good to get started, Craig? I can drop off and hand it over to you.
Yeah, sounds good. Don't go too far. But yes, that sounds good.
I'll be right here in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, so nice to be able to connect with everyone here today. Thank you so much for coming to the session, and I hope you benefited from the videos. We had just a little bit of time to talk about just a couple of concepts, and so if you'd like, we can dive a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that were covered during the video. And also, I am happy to answer any other questions to the best of my ability around storytelling. So I'm happy to help. A couple of people have talked about the sweatshirt. This comes from my friend Stephanie Campos, who is CEO of Latinas Create. And so if you want to check out all the great work that Stephanie does, go to LinkedIn for Stephanie Campos. So I'm going to go ahead and look into the chat and see what's cooking here. It looks like, folks are really happy about the opportunity to create stories from data. And one of the first questions is this. It's from Jesse. And hey, Jesse, thank you so much for the question. And it's nice to be able to connect with you. It says, what's the best way to engage an unwilling audience with data, especially in DEI with senior leadership? Whoa. Yeah, that's a really, really heavy question. And so, I think you've got to start small with a situation like that. Your audience, as we talked a little bit before, is really the reason why ideas go or do not go forward. And so being able to connect with your audience, being able to communicate and connect with them is so critically important. So I think if an audience is generally unwilling, especially stakeholders who are largely in part responsible for helping things move forward, then you have to find a common denominator. You need to be able to identify what we could all agree on that an organization needs to move forward, and then build from there. Because I think if you start from a space where people may feel defensive, if you start from a space where people may feel alienated, and sometimes people do as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, then it's going to be a lot harder to be able to bridge gaps. So my recommendation is doing an audience analysis, and that is finding out a few things about the individuals before beginning to communicate with them, and start small and grow larger. So questions like, what keeps you up at night as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the business? What does success look like to you as it relates to DEI and the business? I keep including and the business because when it comes down to it, that's why people are coming to work every day. And while I think for those of us who appreciate and understand that DEI is as critical as research, not everyone sees it that way just yet. And so being able to find a common denominator between the two and our audience is a great way to begin building relationships and a conversation and then growing. So I would start there. So hopefully, Jesse, that answers your question. Feel free to respond back in the chat. I'm happy to be able to take that a little bit further. The next question comes from Dawn Fry. Thank you so much, Dawn. Same question as Jesse. Where do you start, especially when your organization is uber focused on performance? Well, yes. So at the bottom, it's the bottom line, right? They want to see the results, right? And so I think that you have to meet them where they are and then work backwards. So begin with the end in mind. So if the idea is, let's just use DEI, that we want to see, let's see, stronger retention, an increase in diversity, a enhanced culture as it relates to belonging and inclusion. We want to see that in the numbers, and you do too. Then we start with the end in mind and work backwards. Why do people provide good feedback as it relates to culture and inclusion? Well, because they feel that they belong. Well, what can make people feel that they belong? Well, it's not necessarily going to be pizza on a Friday, but it's going to be daily interactions with other employees and colleagues like themselves and feel like they can contribute to the broader mission of the company. So maybe an idea is, and we did this at the company that I work at, is that we have sessions periodically where people talk about their journeys. People talk about their own stories. And the reason why I say that is because, as you know, stories really affect the brain in quite a special way. Our brain can't delineate between what's fact and fiction. And so when someone tells you their story, when someone tells you why they are who they are and why they do what they do, it really helps bridge gaps and helps people answer questions that they may have had in their mind. So my recommendation would be is, for instance, provide a platform or an opportunity where there's a safe space where you can tell stories about one another, ones that are captivating and compelling, and then be able to move forward and see how you can begin to build those gaps, those bridges. And that's all a part of communicating and storytelling, right? It's the broader narrative, not written by you, but by the people who are part of the organization. Okay, so thanks so much, Jesse. Thank you so much, Dawn. Hopefully that answers your question or begins to. I'm going to move up to Gretchen. Hi, Gretchen. Thanks for the kind words. I really appreciate it. You said that I appreciated Florence Nightingale, the example that we used in the video. Did military leadership know there was a mortality issue and it didn't hit their heart yet? Or did she uncover and elevate an issue that wasn't well understood? I think there is a difference, and there is a difference. From what I understand, the data was available to everyone. I think it was available to everyone. I think that priorities, however, were mismatched. I think the priorities of those stakeholders and those in leadership positions were elsewhere, and so the focus weren't or was not on the front line. That is with the soldiers. And so I think it was a matter of her bringing this to the top and expressing it in a way to garner support not only from leaders, military leaders, state leaders, but ordinary men and women who were sending their young men, frankly, into war. I think that's probably what began to turn the tide. I'm not an expert on Florence Nightingale, but just from the reading, that's what I get the impression of. Also, Florence Nightingale was already quite well known in her community because of her background, and so I think she was able to leverage, the credibility that she already had, and that helped give a listening ear. So that's what I took away from my reading. I'm not an expert, but I certainly think that's it. But I do agree with you. Sometimes people just don't know, and then bringing it to their attention really turns the tide. Sometimes people's priorities are elsewhere, and so they may know, but they may know superficially, and their focus is on something else. Today we have received news of some terrible, terrible shootings that have taken place in the United States. And I think people know that a number of people have lost their lives. When you begin and dig about the individuals who lost their lives, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom raised children, were now beginning an area of their life where they were free to reap the benefits of their parenthood and the life they live in the United States, many by ballroom dancing and enjoying themselves and expressing themselves through art and dance. They were aunts and uncles, and they were slaughtered. They were slaughtered. That begins to change the narrative. So I think once you elevate the stories behind the data, even though people are aware of the data, but of course the people behind those numbers, I think the conversation takes on a different tone. So, okay, all right. Thank you, Gretchen. Hopefully that answers your question. And obviously, I'm open to further conversation. Jesse asked the question: what was the heart and data example you gave in your talk, and what keeps you motivated to keep telling stories around data until you get the aha? What was the heart? Trying to make sure I understand your exact question, Jesse. But your question, what keeps you motivated to keep telling stories around data until you get the aha? Well, I think stories are important because it's a way to amplify ideas, especially for those who may not have that opportunity. There are many individuals and companies who are at entry level positions or maybe work at institutions or organizations that are so huge that they're control and command. And it's only when you reach a certain level that you begin to get ears, around your ideas. But ideas trump hierarchy. And so, why is it then that an entry level individual shouldn't have her idea heard when it's one that can actually help the company? So, I believe that being able to tell stories, and stories are amplifiers, right, can help individuals express their voice, especially when they have very little in their organizations, to reach the highest levels and to begin to garner support. Because once you have allies and support, then your ideas begin to get momentum. So that's what keeps me going. I do a little bit of speaking, but I'm more of a speaker coach these days. So I get the greatest joy of actually helping people bring their ideas into action. That's what keeps me going. And the aha moments are just breathtaking. And my friend Ophelia Johnson, who's giving a talk later on, speaks to that. So if you see her video, definitely check that out. Okay, Molly, in the age of competing data and facts, what advice would you give about creating common ground? Yeah, boy. Um, Storytelling is very, very, very powerful. And I often tell people that we should view storytelling the same way we would view using an automobile, or using something else that could quite frankly inflict a lot of damage, because storytelling can. You see, storytelling is so powerful that again, our brains really can't delineate between fact or fiction. It doesn't know whether or not it's seeing something real or not. And so when you're watching a movie, while you know that it's produced by Disney, your heart's telling you something else, right? The brain is processing it in a whole different way. Your palms are sweaty, your heart is racing. And so it's important that we tell true stories, right? Stories of fact and not fiction, in order to be able to affect change. So, in the age of competing data and facts and creating common ground, I think in speaking to audiences is really trying to find whatever common denominator you can. And it's hard in a bipolar society, but maybe it's just around things that we can all appreciate, like the future of our children. It's something that we all can invest in. And maybe we can point to some data that suggests that they have a bright future. Maybe some breakthrough technologies that we're seeing are going to give us an opportunity to do things we thought we could never do, like Chat GPT. There's some other data, on the other hand, that suggests that the world outside might be such that it is going to affect the health of our children, like the environment. And so, how can we create a sustainable environment in which our children can leverage technology to live a life that we never dreamed of, but at the same time, not to suffer from the debilitating effects of global warming? So, we're acknowledging perhaps both sides, if you will, of an argument, and trying to come to some cohesive, synonymous answer together, or consensus together. So again, finding that common denominator is so important, and that really means knowing your audience. I can't express how important it is to really understand your audience. So hopefully that answers your question. Communication can only take us so far, of course, but we have to use stories wisely, because they are such powerful tools. People are licensed to use cars. Sometimes I think people should be licensed to go out on social media if they're going to tell stories, because they can cause quite a bit of damage. Okay, so I was able to get through. One thing I did want to mention to you is talking about problems and articulating problems when it comes to elevating your ideas. And I see another question came in, so we'll get to you in just one second. Um, in some of the research that I've done, a gentleman by the name of Donald Miller came up with a storytelling framework called StoryBrand. That's another book that I highly recommend that you get. And in it, he talks about when you're articulating the problem that you're here to solve, that problems are in existence at three levels. Um, there is the problem at its very face, right? The problem that you can touch and see every day. Um, but then is the emotional level of the problem. So what's the emotional level? Well, that is how the problem, the physical problem, makes us feel emotionally, right? Or the external problem, how does it make us feel internally? And that usually begins to garner interest because people really connect more to things as it relates to emotions. So we could say in tech today, there's a challenge for many workers because they're losing their jobs right now, right? Maybe we know some of them. Well, that's true, and we can point to the metrics and say that. But if I told you many workers today are feeling anxiety and pressure because of the current working conditions, that might garner a little bit more interest because all of us share that same anxiety. All of us share that same kind of stress. But then there's even another layer of problem, and it's called the philosophical level, right? So we have the external problem, the one that we can point to every day and point to and touch it, the internal problem, how it makes us feel, right? And then the philosophical problem. So the philosophical problem is, what does this matter anyway, right? Why does this even matter? So let me just give you an example. How many of you have heard of the movie The King's Speech? Do you remember that very popular movie that came out? And it had to do with a man who had to rally England around the German army who was approaching. And the problem was he had a speech impediment, so we had a speaker coach. And the problems that existed at the time was at three levels. The first was the external problem, which was the advancing German army, right? That was his external problem that he looked at and could face and point to and look at metrics. The internal problem was he was full of anxiety because while his father was a great orator and could rally the country behind him, he was different. He was just different. He had a speech impediment and needed a coach to be able to help him with that. So he felt anxiety and fear. The philosophical problem was, and again, that's why does this matter anyway, was good versus evil, right? So when you're approaching your organization and talking about the problem that it's facing, I bet 9 out of 10 people know what the external problem is, but few often articulate it internally. The system that we're using today is affecting our workers such that they're anxious as to whether or not they can get their job done. Many people feel that they're losing sleep or time on the weekends, and they're anxious because it's taking time away from their families. That's a whole different conversation. And at a philosophical level, we can say, hey, listen, what we already do at our company is hard. The way we work shouldn't be. So as you're approaching story and you're expressing problems, remember to express them more than just externally, but the internal or the emotional effect it has. And if you can, the philosophical level as well. Okay, back to the questions. Just wanted to make sure I share that with you. Jesse says, in order to inspire change, what's the best way to positively spin rather than sit in the negative, like your example on Chat GPT versus environment? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Um, you know, I think that when we talk about problems, for instance, I think that, we can talk about the emotional effect and then the philosophical problem, and then to inspire change in people rather than to be negative. We can let individuals know that problems are mostly made by us. I mean, they can be solved by us. Um, Not pointing to one specific person and or group, but to really focus on the problem in and of itself and how we can solve it. That's like in any relationship, right? We want to point to the problem and not to the other person. And so communicating stories about change in the past can help us in the future garner that courage that we need. In fact, Duarte, again, and I always go back to her, has a great book called Illuminate. And she talks about how change is like a journey. I think you'd probably agree. And if you think about having to climb the summit, there's a part of that journey where you're kind of deep in the valley and you need endurance. And so sometimes you have to communicate stories of endurance to organizations and colleagues. And that can really help because sometimes people just want to give up because they feel like they're hitting the same problem again and again. when really they just need to get over that hill, if you will, in order to be able to climb and get to the summit. So to inspire change, I would relate powerful stories of resilience and how we can reflect those as well in our own organization. They may not be as big and as famous as the ones that we identify, but they still are done by people just like us. All right, great questions here. Looks like they're being answered. And so, Jesse, if I answered your question, please let me know. I'm going into the chat just to see what's happening. Yes, the King's Speech was a good movie. Lots of teachable moments. Completely agree. Hi, Annette. So great to see you. Hopefully, we're able to answer any questions that you have, but you know how to get in contact with me. So thank you so much. Going back to our Q&A. Okay, great. Looks like, Jesse, that's been answered. So fantastic. Okay, so we're moving. So we're almost at the top of the hour, and I think that's where we're going to stop. So let me just leave just a couple of things with you that hopefully you'll be able to implement immediately in your communications, presentations, or your conversations. So here's the first. One, have a data point of view. That we talked about that, right? Two is make sure that you can make numbers emotional or relatable, right? And three, when we talk about the problems that we're looking to overcome and solve for, we can express those problems at three different levels. And I challenge you to be able to articulate the emotional or the internal problem, right? If you've ever gone to Lowe's or Home Depot and they're advertising lawnmowers, the advertisements are never this. Come buy our lawnmowers because your grass is too long, right? That's the most boring commercial you've ever heard of. What typically the commercials are is the grass is growing long, it's the springtime, your lawnmower is broke, and the neighbors are kind of side-eyeing you. And how do you feel internally? Embarrassed, right? Internally, you feel embarrassed. That's why people are going to buy a lawnmower. They don't really care that the grass is so high. What they care about is what their neighbors think. So when we're talking with leaders or decision makers, we're talking about problems, talk about how the problem is making people feel, because that's really what's going to inhibit us from being productive in our daily work. When it comes to the philosophical problem, if you can reach that, if you can say, hey, what we do for our mission is already hard, the way we work shouldn't be. I have an approach that I think is going to be much more efficient. And here it is, and express the data point of view. So that would be my feedback for everyone to take away. So we're almost at the top of the hour. If you have any last moment questions, feel free to hit me up. Please also hit me up on LinkedIn. So it's Craig Thomason. I'm at LinkedIn. I would love to be able to chat with you further and connect with you. And if you have any storytelling projects, would love to hear your approach and how you're going about it. Again, the three books are Data Story, Making Numbers Count, and Story Brand. These are three, I think, really good reference books, and there are many others that you can use when it comes to communicating. What are some of the best communication channels in order to tell stories of DEI? Okay, so thankfully, I can speak from experience as it relates to this question, so I'm very happy to share this with you. At Merck, we have someone responsible for diversity and inclusion, like most organizations. She does a fantastic job. But DEI isn't the responsibility of one person. It's everyone's responsibility. And so while there are best practices and programs and standards that we've set in our company, it's really up to us to institute channels, if you will, in order to be able to engender a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So I worked with our R&D group on a TED-like series where individuals gave talks, just like the ones you heard, about their own stories. And the feeling is that while we could talk about diversity and its importance and how it needs to be applied, no one's really going to really feel what it means to want to belong or feel like they were an outsider until they hear the stories. There is some neurological studies that suggest that storytellers and the feelings that they go through are mirrored by their audience. In fact, Dr. Yuri Hassan, who I still believe is a professor at Princeton University, wrote an entire paper around how emotions are mimicked, first from the presenter and then to the audience. So just imagine that you have a situation where people are talking about their own story and there are themes around it. So, just as an example, I worked with a scientist who is from Vietnam, and she escaped the Vietnam War, and she went through a harrowing experience to come to the United States, a harrowing experience. And the title of her talk was "Carry the Lessons, Not the Baggage." Carry the lessons, not the baggage. Powerful story. And I heard about how she had to stay at some camps, and there were terrible things taking place. And then how she made it to the United States, and her experience as now an Asian American, and some of the prejudice that she experienced. Well, anyway, the individuals at the time who came from Vietnam into the United States, this is a famous chapter in world history. Most of her colleagues did not know she went through that. People thought perhaps she's from an Asian, based country, or maybe New Jersey, but they didn't know her story. But when they understood it, that opened up a variety of questions about what she went through, especially the prejudice that she experienced as an Asian American here in the United States. And so that program has gone on for several years now. The training that these speakers get is top notch. I learned it from folks like Tara, who you may have seen in the chat, and Steve Gargiulo and others, and passed that on to these speakers. And it's been a wonderful way for people to be able to connect and feel like they can belong or understand the stories of others who perhaps really weren't made to feel like they belong early on. So if you can create a platform for authentic storytelling, I think that's a great way to engender diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There are many others, but boy, stories, powerful. So it's not by you, but it's by the individuals in your organization. And believe me, things do change after that. Okay, great. Let's see. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, Gretchen, do you have any favorite tools or methods for data analysis? That's a good question. I have to think about that, to be honest with you. Um, as a writer and a creative, I have to work very hard to be comfortable with numbers, right? To mine the data in order to unearth the gem and then be able to identify its impact now and, more importantly, to create a vision for the future. So that's a really good question. I have to really think about it. I'm not sure if I have any best practices or methods that I could share, but I will tell you that it is a collaborative effort. I do not work in a silo, but with many, many, many smart data analysts and people who are quite good at that to be able to assist me. That is definitely a best practice. So more to come on that. Thank you, Gretchen. Maybe I'll post that on a social media platform. I'm able to share that. From Carla Gardner, which visuals besides data sets do you like to use when presenting data with your story? Yeah. Oh boy. In the book Data Story by Nancy Duarte, she has a couple of chapters on different types of visuals that you can provide. I would say the best type of visuals are the simplest to understand as it relates to your audience. So I think that traditionally in many corporate settings, the visuals that are provided are often hard to see and takes quite a bit of time to understand and loses all the impact that it needs. So using simple, intuitive visuals is the best way, in my opinion, to be able to communicate to your audience. And so there are a variety of ways that you can do that. If you do a Google search on Nancy Duarte, she talks a little bit about that, and I highly recommend you take a look at that. Okay, Lashea, hi, and I'm gonna try to pronounce your last name. I think it's Angelopoulos. If it's not, I apologize, or Angelopoulos. But it's so nice to see you. Love the suggestion to be able to articulate the emotional or internal problem concerning how the problem is making people feel. Yes, I think this relates back to one of the original questions around engaging uninterested leaders. If we appeal to how they might or should feel about some of the data, we might trigger increased engagement. I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more, right? So, it's one thing for a leader to be told that productivity is dropping. Yeah, I know. These people need to work harder, could be the response. But it's quite another thing to say, as you're well aware, data suggests that productivity is dropping. But as we look closer at the numbers and the stories behind them, I think you'd be interested in hearing some of the stories as to why. Right now, you've got their attention, and in expressing that, you're getting to that internal point, right, of the problem. Maybe people are burnt out. Um, Maybe people don't feel like they belong and can contribute. Maybe it's a hierarchical control and command. And so while they've got new ideas and better ways of working, they're squashed, right? Because of the current culture and environment, and they're feeling stressed about it and are looking elsewhere when they feel the time is right. That can definitely change a leader's mind for sure. So, yes, get people to feel the numbers as opposed to just understand them or be aware of them. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Lachey. I really appreciate that. Hopefully that answered your question. Advi Bishnoi, uh, hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. Do you feel any specific tool suggestions, or rather, do you have any specific tool suggestions for making minimalistic visuals? This goes towards simplicity. Great questions. So I do have some ideas. I do. What I think maybe I'll do is post something on LinkedIn because we've gotten a few questions around visuals. And I think that requires a separate conversation with the visuals in mind as well, and some examples. So for the folks who have asked about visuals, please hold me to it by connecting with me on LinkedIn, and then stay tuned because I'll have to post probably an article about some of the visuals and tools that you can use to make these graphics understandable. I do want to stress that your visuals should be intuitive for non-data persons. That is extremely important. Um, when you're in a conversation with individuals who are data analysts, speak your geek. Go for it. Go for it. But 9 times out of 10, when you're trying to affect change, especially when you're talking to leadership, some of them will be able to get it, but not all. And so they want to be able to easily understand the visuals and be able to recognize what the problem is, more importantly, the solution that you're offering. So I would definitely speak to that for sure. Okay, great questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. We've got a few minutes left, so I wanna give you the time to see if you have any more questions. I'm here for you. Um, if you're all interested in storytelling, and I think probably one of the greatest storytelling organizations in our generation is Pixar. They have a free storytelling module that you can go to and download, and they've got some great stuff. And some of the things that we talked about already, you'll find there. And there are other things, especially around story arcs, that I think you'll really appreciate. So, for all of our Pixar fans, definitely recommend that you take a look at that. It's quite helpful, and it's often used by businesses as well. All right, I'm gonna hop on the chat real quick. Speak your geek. That's right, Iris. Canvas, yes, that is a great tool. Yep. Let's see. I saw this firsthand in a previous job. Our head of HR didn't engage with the numbers, but when I got her a few quotes from personal stories, she opened up. So that was from Katrina. Thank you for letting us know that. Love that two-way communication capability as the key for the impact of storytelling. Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate that. Befriending data analysts and building close relationships with them is also a great idea. We need data analysts for a variety of reasons, and the world is very quickly changing. And so I think there's going to be a very close collaboration between creatives and storytellers, data analysts, data compilers, programmers around AI, because the way we articulate information has to be done in a way that's not only going to affect the mind, but the heart, so that people will internalize it and it will come out in their actions. I love Chat GPT and so many of the other tools that are being worked on. And Well, I understand we're going to see some really big platforms coming out from Google and Microsoft in the not too distant future. And they're going to really generate some great content if you're a content creator. And they're going to be powerful, but it's going to be important for you to be able to aim for the heart, right? The outputs will definitely aim for the head, right? But you have to aim for the heart as well in order to affect change. Okay, I'm going to go back to Q&A, see if there's any more questions. Cindy Green says, people tend to overly focus on the details of the data or the tools instead of the purpose and the goal. Why is that? Yeah, and how best do you move them to the purpose in order to take action? That's a really good point. I think, I don't know if I can answer why, to be honest with you, why people tend to really focus just on that as opposed to, well, what's the outcome here? But the best way to move them, I think, really, is to share with them the impact of the data. I think we saw that just a couple of years ago when it came to some of the stories that were around the United States around race, and that George Floyd became a household name. Why? Well, he had suffered, he died at the hands of police. There's been data around police brutality in the African American community for decades. So why now? Why did it sort of become a jumping off point, if you will, a reconciliation? Well, I think that when people heard George Floyd's story and then they saw it in real time, and it was at a time that I think that racial tensions were at a certain level, then people demanded change. And there was a new, a refreshed conversation. And I think there's also going to be some around other challenges that we have here in the United States. So sometimes it's timing that we need. And sometimes it's the right story, if you will, at the right time that begins the right conversation to move people in the right direction. So, if you've got a story that's not taking hold, it might not be the right time, but it doesn't mean to stop. It means to keep going, because at a certain point, it's going to be the right time. You'll be able to look back and be able to cite all these examples, and that amalgamation of stories is really going to help move people. So keep that in mind as well. Thank you, Cindy. I think that's an excellent point. Okay, I think we've got 4 minutes left, so we'll take one more question. If you have it, again, please hit me up on LinkedIn. I'll be doing a little bit of writing soon, so hold me to it. Any questions or feedback about the talk? Love to hear it. I'm going to go into the chat real quick. Jake, yes, love the example of how George Floyd's murder made the case for change inescapable. It really did. It really, really did. It was the story of George Floyd, and of course so many others before and frankly after. And I hope that is the case in other areas as well. Absolutely. Hi, Iris.
I want to thank you very, very much for sharing all of your wisdom today. And I know there's a lot of great book recommendations and the call to add you on LinkedIn and to hear more. And I'm certainly going to do that and can't wait. So now in this part of the conference, now is time for networking. You can check out the expo booths. So we're going to join back at 12:30 on the main stage for our awards ceremony. Steve has a question here, and yes, do you want to repeat, Craig, about the killer sweatshirt?
Yeah. Hey, Steve. How's it going, buddy? So Stephanie Campos, who's the CEO of Latinas Create, has these great sweatshirts. And so you can check her out on LinkedIn and all the great work that she does. She's a journalist, a social influencer, and talks about the impact that our Latin community, especially our Latinas, have in American culture and business. So definitely check it out.
Perfecto. Gracias. Thank you all. Thank you, Craig. Thanks.
That's good. Thanks, everyone. Nice meeting you.
All right.